It's March. It's almost springtime. So I actually think it's a really interesting and exciting time for, particularly in the United States, if you're here local. The news on the health front seems to be getting better and better. I think President Biden has promised vaccines to pretty much everyone by May. I'm already vaccinated because I'm a healthcare professional. Most people over 65 have had the opportunity to get vaccinated, and I think most of the young folks will as well by summertime. So I'm actually optimistic that things will be a lot better by summertime, if not reopen. Texas actually reopened a little bit earlier this week, and I think the rest of the country likely will as well. Rates of coronavirus have actually been dropping, so I actually think it's going to be, if it does go as intended, a very celebratory summer, because people have obviously been cooped up for a long time. And my prediction is that we're going to see something like the Summer of Love in 1968 in the Bay Area, or the Roaring '20s, where people are going to definitely go a little bit wild. So on that note, I kind of invited folks over social media, and especially the men in our community. There is basically 15 weeks and 4 days until the start of summer, or about 16 weeks. And so it's an amazing opportunity to get your health in order. It's going to be, as I like to call it, hot boy summer, to follow up with hot girl summer last year. So given that I think things are going to reopen, people are going to be back out enjoying the fresh air, back out on the beach. You kind of want to be beach body ready to go. So take this opportunity as a nice challenge for yourself to get into shape over the next 15, 16 weeks, because I do think the world will be in a better place, and this is a great opportunity to do it. So if you're interested in getting a little bit of support along the way, join our squads here on Discord. We'll put you in a group of about 10 guys, just like an army squad, who can provide social support, accountability, and health behavior coaching. We actually had a user submit a question in advance, said he sends his apologies for not being able to join, but he would love to know, number one, how should one go about selecting a therapist? This is a really great question. I actually encourage everyone to do therapy at some point in their lives. And one myth that I'd like to dispel is the notion that you have to have something wrong with you to go to therapy. Psychology is different than the medical model. The medical model, unfortunately, operates under a sick care system where insurance will only reimburse you if you have something wrong with you, right? So for instance, if you want to get your testosterone levels checked, your doctor's going to be like, why? You look healthy. Or do you have any symptoms? And if you don't, then he's not going to often do the test, and insurance won't reimburse for it. You have to literally be like, I have a problem or I have a symptom, and then that justifies the expense of testing. I think that's why essentially 90% of mental health professionals do not take insurance, because they don't want to just be in the sick care business. And psychology was never part of that medical model, sick care model anyway. Of course, we do diagnose and treat mental illness or psychological issues, but also a lot of therapy is oriented around personal growth and personal development, right? You may be just facing life transitions or challenges. So for instance, just like Michael was talking about, maybe you're transitioning to a new job and you are just, you're not necessarily struggling with it, but you're like, you know what? I did okay in my last few jobs. I really want to get promoted. I really want to climb, the hierarchy here and become a leader at the company. What can I do to be, most effective, high performing, in order to, get that raise, get that promotion, to, achieve my career goals? And actually working with a therapist or working with a executive psychologist in particular might be very, very conducive towards that. So that's the thing I would say first and foremost. You do not need to have a problem to go into therapy. Second of all of us have problems. The reality is, like, all of these issues and traits are spectrums, right? Sadness and anxiety are not pathological in and of themselves, right? All of us experience negative emotions. All of us are imperfect. I'll be the first to say that myself, right? I talk about dopamine fasting all the time. And I don't practice it all the time. I do my best, but I'm probably on social media more than I need to be sometimes. And, it's a work in progress, right? But regardless of those things, there's always essentially opportunities for us to be better. And therapy is a very unique context in which to do that. And I'll tell you why it's different than other means of personal development. So you can obviously just like read a lot of this stuff on your own. You can go buy, in fact, a CBT or ACT workbook, which are both evidence-based psychotherapies that I teach and utilize, and actually get a lot of benefit from it. There are, in fact, research studies that show that what's called bibliotherapy or book therapy, or essentially self-help through a book, or it's usually a workbook or a manual that you go through, can be effective if you have the motivation to sit there and do the exercises and read through it. Challenge is obviously if you're struggling with something, you know, lack of motivation is a symptom of depression, and it may be hard to just do that on your own, versus like sometimes just showing up to a meeting every week is a little bit easier for most people to do. So that's the first and foremost. But second, I would argue, and I think most good clinicians who are worth their salt argue, that the relationship itself is healing, right? So from a little bit more of a psychodynamic point of view, so if you're having issues with relationships, the issues that you're facing in relationships, or you're not finding the ideal partner, for instance, so maybe it's not an issue, but it's you're not fully fulfilled in terms of your relationships. That dynamic you're going to replay in the context of the therapy room with your therapist, right? And instead of, you know, maybe women have been pushing you away every time you get defensive or every time you sort of shut down emotionally, and they're like, no, I don't want to deal with that. And then they reject you or break up with you. You know, your therapist obviously is not going to break up with you, and they will process that with you and be like, hey, I notice every time that I provide you with constructive feedback, you sort of shut down emotionally and you get sort of defensive. Can you tell me how you're feeling in the moment, you know, when I bring that up with you, right? And you sit there and you work through those things, and you do it in sort of a safe space, a tough container that is not going to break, right? And so if you think about it in a lot of ways, therapy really is a container that's designed to hold, right? And no matter what you're kind of going through, no matter what challenges you're even like throwing at the therapist, they should ideally be there and hold that container, hold that bond, and help you provide almost what's called a corrective emotional experience, so that you can face these things in a safe, confidential, safe space. You can have the benefit of a third-party observer who can, you know, as I always say, you can cut your own hair, but it's hard to see the back of your head, right? They can just provide that objectivity that other people can't. And you can work through that issue. That's why I actually think a lot of these time-limited therapies, although you can make huge gains, I would say, like if you're dealing with a specific phobia, you have OCD, etc., there's good evidence that like in 12 weeks or so, you can make pretty clinically meaningful improvements. But if you're talking about sort of transforming your life, I think the evidence shows that on average about 50 sessions of psychotherapy, 50, which is actually a lot, right? It's basically going to therapy every day for a week or every other week for 2 years, is about the right amount of time to see long-standing change. But the good news though is that it's lasting, right? So even when people discontinue therapy, I think the research shows that even years later, 2.5 years later, I believe is one follow-up study that I recall seeing, people continue to have benefits. And the reason for that is because through the context of the relationship, you do learn concrete skills, right? You learn how to relate better with people, right? And you're having someone mirror and frame that and you know, give you feedback on that. And so you learn, you internalize those things, you practice them in the real world, and it becomes part of you. In fact, I always argue that great therapists essentially make themselves redundant, right? They almost like, in some ways, you want as a therapist to have the client internalize almost your voice, your perspective, have you sitting on their shoulder. And so when they're dealing with an issue, they're like, what would Dr. Cam say, right? Or what are the tools, skills, frameworks that he's taught me? And so I can sit there, think through that, and be able to do it on my own. Good therapy, good coaching essentially fosters independence. So this is a little bit of the interesting paradox in therapy, in that you really do want to work with someone long-term, because that's how you build a close, meaningful relationship. And I would argue it is the relationship that heals, or it is the relationship that optimizes. On the other hand, though, you are fostering independence, not dependence. No therapist wants to keep clients long time to churn money out of them, because when you do good work, people leave and they refer 3 of their friends. And so there's never a question of that in terms of dependence. So I think those are all good reasons for why you should do therapy in the first place. So now, going back to the question, how should one go about selecting a therapist? The unfortunate thing in our field is that the quality of therapists is quite variable. There are some really good, really outstanding therapists that literally save people's lives and transform them. And quite frankly, there's some really terrible ones. And I think, unfortunately, it has to do a little bit with self-selection in terms of the people who go into the field, and a little bit with unfortunate, there's a lot of divergence in training, I would say. So that's the first place to start, is I would look at the education and training of the person. So rule number one, and I've talked about this on a mental health podcast, is you want to ideally hire someone who went to a school that you've heard of before. It doesn't need to be Harvard, but generally like a state school like UCLA, some place you've heard of before, is a good bet. There are a lot of professional schools that churn out marriage and family therapists, IDs, etc. They charge an arm and a leg. They have people go into great debt, and they don't really care who gets into their program because they're making money off of them. That's very different than like UCLA, which is the top program in the country where I went, that accepted 3% of applicants, right? Harder to get into than Harvard, ironically, where I went to college. So just the quality and caliber, intelligence, drive of someone who goes to a good school, a proper school where they're able to be fully funded, versus someone who, quite frankly, probably paid for their degree, makes a big difference. So that's a great hallmark. Number two, did they go to an APA accredited internship or fellowship program, right? And the people who have usually will say that on their website or their Psychology Today profile. For instance, if they got trained at a VA or an academic medical center, that's a good sign that it's probably an APA accredited place. And then the third thing is, have they demonstrated specialization or true expertise in the area that you're interested in? So basically every single therapist in the world will say they treat anxiety and depression. There's kind of like bread and butter issues that, quite frankly, any therapist will do. But for instance, I actually had someone reach out to me the other day and said, hey, I'm specifically struggling with OCD. I'm looking for someone who can treat that. And I would say, look for an OCD specialist. In fact, in LA, there are entire clinics and practices that do nothing but OCD treatment. They're very, very good. They're very specialized. And quite frankly, they're probably better than any individual therapist who does kind of everything. So look for people who have demonstrated that, either because they make their practice about that thing, right? So I'm actually a good example of that. So I would say my specialties, originally clinically, it was like health psychology, behavioral medicine. So if you're dealing with chronic medical issue or anything somatic, I dealt with that. I have another specialty in anxiety disorders, right? I spent 3 years in an anxiety disorder research center at UCLA just treating anxiety disorders, right? So if you're coming to me for one of those two issues, you know that I've spent years kind of working on those things. Nowadays, I basically focus on men's health, right? That's why we focus on this at Maximus. And also I specialize particularly in working with executives, especially technology CEOs. Like 80% of my practice are basically tech CEOs. I'm known for that. I get referrals from VCs and CEOs because I'm one of the rare people who is and has been a CEO and also a psychologist. And so that's my brand, right? People don't come to me because they have a teenager with bulimia. I will refer them out to someone who's an eating disorder expert, right? But if you're a guy and you're dealing with issues about how to be a better man or how do I run my company better, I'm your guy, right? So you want to go to someone who they talk about it in terms of their social media. They've published books about it. They're demonstrating some sort of expertise about it. So those are the three things that I'd look for: good education, training, APA accredited internship and fellowship, demonstrated expertise in the thing that you are interested in doing. And then fourth, if you can find it, this is optional, is obviously a referral is a good thing, right? If someone has worked with that before, like they're a friend of yours and that's their therapist and they rave about them, that's obviously helpful. Obviously, you can also talk, if you have friends like me who are professionals and you're like, you know anyone, it's always great when you make sort of a peer or reference to a colleague. So that's a plus. I know everyone doesn't necessarily have someone that they can ask, but that's why I consider it kind of a bonus. All right, so question number 2, he asks, does online therapy work? So let's be clear what we're talking about when we're talking about online therapy. Now, if we're talking about live or synchronous therapy that's delivered just like we're talking right now through telemedicine, Absolutely. In fact, my entire practice has transitioned from, I used to have an office, see people in person the traditional way, and now it's moved completely over to a HIPAA compliant Zoom. And the reason for that is twofold. One, the research evidence clearly shows that online or video therapy works just as well as in-person therapy. So there's no difference in terms of outcomes, and it's quite frankly just as good. So that obviously gave me confidence as an evidence-based clinician who tries to at least follow evidence-based practices or best practices, that I'm not reducing the quality of my care by switching to Zoom. As long as the video quality is good, it's not interrupting, you're not having issues, you can see them loud and clear, you can see their facial expressions and their body language, and you can effectively convey, your thoughts, your feelings, and your emotions. It's no different, right? And I think we're so used to a virtual world that it's a very similar sort of experience. I imagine one day we'll be doing therapy in VR, and it'll be a hologram, and your brain won't even know the difference at that point. And we're probably not even too many years away from that with Oculus and some of the new technologies that are coming out. So I don't think as long as you're having a real conversation with someone, even if it's on telephone, I would say I prefer video to telephone, but telephone can be effective. Nowadays, I don't really see any reason why someone should do telephone in the Zoom sort of era. But I occasionally have clients in which I'll be on the video and they'll be taking a walk in the park and they'll be power walking that hour, and then they'll want to be on the phone. That I think, you do lose a little bit of fidelity. I do like seeing people's voice and body language, their face and their body language. But on the other hand, if they're getting an hour of exercise, I don't know, maybe it makes up for it in a different way. So I think that does work. What is unclear is whether text-based therapies or asynchronous therapies work. I think if you're really talking about the treatment of traditional psychological issues, and like I said, if the instrument of change is building a relationship, then I think it's harder. So if you're talking about seeking traditional therapy, I do recommend people do this live synchronous thing. I know there's some companies out there, I don't know if it's Talkspace or what, that are doing like this text-based, chat-based therapy. I think if you're dealing with this like a traditional issue, like you have OCD or anxiety or depression, I don't think the evidence is as strong there. I wouldn't recommend it for that reason. Now, there's a different model, right, which is a lot more like Omada Health, which is the first company that I helped start as their founding medical director. We were helping people who did not have diabetes yet, right? So they weren't diagnosed with a formal illness. They had risk factors though. They're overweight, they have high blood sugar, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, dyslipidemia, and they need to lose weight in order to not get sick. We did use asynchronous coaching, right? We put people into small online groups, paired them with a health coach. They would chat, they could use an app, private message the coach, they could message the other members of the group, and that actually worked wonderfully well. That was not therapy though, right? That's a little bit more what we call health coaching. And that in fact is kind of the model and inspiration for Maximus Tribe, in that the guys who join this community don't necessarily have any particular problem. They just want to look, feel, and perform their best as a man. And so they can join, the squads, asynchronously chat, because again, it's not therapy. It's not medical treatment. It's peer coaching. And there is a lot of research literature supporting these sort of peer coaching, community-based programs as effective. So I would say, yes, if you're dealing with a traditional issue, I'd want it to be live. If it's a lot more around, I just want to do health coaching, I just want to be better. It's not like, make or break in terms of getting treatment, then I do think this more asynchronous online approach can work really well. And that's why we're doing it here. All right, third question is, are executive coaches basically expensive therapists, or is there a distinction to keep in mind when choosing one over the other? So this is a really great question, and it's an important thing in terms of terminology. So first of all, there's a difference between protected terms and non-protected terms. Therapist is actually not a protected term. It doesn't actually mean anything. Now, people know what it's supposed to mean, which is it generally refers to psychotherapy, but literally you or anyone out there who's listening can call themselves a therapist without any training. It's the same thing with a coach. Coach literally can mean a sports coach. It can mean a fluency coach who will help you speak better. or an executive coach. There's no license, there's no accreditation. Who knows what the heck that person is? I always tell people you could be working with a license with a felon, right? Who is not remediated, and you have no idea because the term's not protected. Literally anyone can use it, so it's kind of a meaningless term. That's why I don't like it. I refer to myself, for instance, as an executive psychologist. A psychologist or a psychiatrist is a protected term. Like you literally have to have a doctorate degree and a license, and the difference is. You can at least trust that the person is legit. Like you have to have a background check to be a psychologist, a psychiatrist. You have to make sure that you're in good standing. Like you can't have committed crimes. And also you follow state legal and ethical guidelines. You're not going to take advantage of your clients, financially, emotionally, sexually, etc. And you can look them up. Like you can literally look up my license on the internet right now. Make sure that the license is active. I've had no complaints against me ever. And so you can at least have a level of trust around that. And there's laws around that too. So for instance, this is really interesting. Like, we are legally obligated to keep our confidentiality. So for instance, even if someone like is part of the mafia and has committed murders, we can't report that if it's something that's happened in the past and they're no longer a threat to anyone. And the reason is, well, even criminals deserve to be in therapy and work on their stuff. Now, obviously, if there's an active threat, if someone says, I'm going to kill myself, kill someone else, elder or child being abused, then yes, we're mandated reporters. And of course, we'll report that. But literally everything short of that, we're legally bound to do that. And short of some very extraneous circumstantial sort of legal proceedings, we can't even talk, right? That's why there's attorney-client privilege, doctor-patient privilege as well. And so I always tell people to read this article from HBR. It's called The Very Real Dangers of Executive Coaching. And it talks about even if you're not dealing with pathology or you're not going to someone because you're dealing with an issue, they need to be aware of if you do have an underlying issue, right? The article talks about this salesperson who is causing a lot of problems, and it was because of some underlying issues that they have. But when you work with an executive coach, that has no mental health training, they're not able to recognize that, and they don't know what the real root problem is, right? So I always say, it doesn't matter if you're doing therapy or coaching, you should always work with a licensed mental health professional that is in good standing, has an active license, etc., but has specialization or expertise, as we were talking about, in that field, right? So I'm a licensed psychologist. And I operate and I have that license. I have the training and the background in order to do that. So for instance, one thing that I do with all of my CEO clients, even though they're not coming to me for mental health treatment, is that I do a full psychiatric intake, which is pretty standard practice. You go to any mental health clinician, they're going to spend the first 1 to 3 sessions going through and understanding, do you have any diagnoses, right? So at the end of the first session, I actually report back to my clients and I was like, okay, I've done these scales, these questionnaires. I've done my own intake. I've done my own assessment. Here are some potential issues. This is where you may be clinically significant in terms of your anxiety, your depression, your ADHD. Here's my understanding of why you may be struggling with some things. Here's some areas I still want to explore. And here's my understanding of why you are dealing with the things that you are. Do you agree with that? Can we update that? Can we edit that? And then you'll obviously improve and iterate that over time. But it helps you really understand what are the underlying issues that are driving that. And that's why it's helpful to work with a licensed mental health professional. And ideally someone who understands, what you're dealing with. So there are psychologists, psychiatrists that specialize obviously in working with executives. I think obviously I have, more credibility having been a CEO, been in Silicon Valley for a long time, having some semblance of success. And so I can empathize greater with what people are going through. And a lot of, the interesting challenges that my CEO clients face, they are kind of business related issues. I always tell people, I don't tell people how to run their business, but if you've dealt with those issues before, you can help give people frameworks for, okay, how do I deal with this person who's a great performer, but they're, causing conflicts with their coworkers or other things like that. When you've kind of been through those things before, you're not giving advice. Psychologists actually are not in the business of giving advice. Like I said, we want to help people foster their own independence, but they can help think through it in a more robust way when you're very familiar with those issues. And there are kind of, best practices in terms of dealing with some of those things. So anyway, those are my tips and tricks in terms of finding a therapist, picking between sort of live versus online or synchronous versus asynchronous kind of therapy or coaching, and making sure that if you are working with a coach, quote unquote, you're working with a licensed mental health professional.
What's up, Dr. Camp?
How's it going?
Living the dream.
I love it.
What can I say?
What's new and exciting in your world?
So I started a new workout challenge for March.
Awesome.
Found myself falling behind my workout goals in February. So I committed to doing 100 push-ups and 100 squats every day. So far, so good. 4 days in, I've been consistent and feeling great about it.
Awesome.
Sleeping better, feel more relaxed, able to, release my stress from work. So
that's great to hear that. So did you say 100 squats and 100 push-ups? Is that the goal every day?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Pretty much.
How did you pick that?
Just random, like easy number, 100. Kind of achievable for me, but my main goal is to build the habit of working out every day.
Mm-hmm.
Great thing about my job is I'm able to work from home, but things have been really busy.
Sure.
So there has been days where I spent, 8, 10, 12, 14 hours in front of my computer at home.
I feel you.
Trying to meet deadlines. So it's difficult getting to the gym.
Awesome. And then do you break up the 100 push-ups and 100 squats? Do you do them all at once or all throughout the day?
So I have been breaking them out throughout the day, which I like. 25 push-ups, 25 squats before getting the shower, before breakfast, before lunch, sometimes before meetings.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually a really cool idea. And it's a little bit different than sort of traditional conceptions of exercise, right? I think so many people are used to this idea of like, okay, I got to go get ready to work out, right? I got to go to the gym, got to put on my workout clothes. And there is a benefit to that, especially if you're doing really high intensity type of exercise, whether it's cardio, like you really do need to warm up properly if you're going to be doing any sort of sprinting or exhaustive exercise. If you want to be safe and not like tear anything. Or same thing, if you're lifting particularly heavy weights, you probably do need to kind of warm up and get into it. And so it does make more sense if you're doing that kind of stuff to do it all at once. And particularly also, you might be getting like super sweaty. If you're doing that kind of exhaustive exercise or heavy lifting, you may not want to be super sweaty all throughout the day if you're at a workplace. Although now that we're working from home, maybe it is easier to either not care or take more showers. But in either case, that makes sense for high intensity exercise. However, what you're introducing is this really interesting concept that I think particularly, I always advocate that people need to do 3 types of exercise: low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity exercise. And weightlifting technically is actually more like medium intensity exercise when you're taking, minutes of rest in between your sets. But that kind of exercise, particularly if you're doing it more with body weight, where it's not necessarily super heavy, I think it's relatively safe, for instance, for people, if you're, well-trained and otherwise healthy, you don't have any injuries, to do push-ups or even pull-ups without a significant amount of warm-up, right? As long as you're, doing it in a mindful way, making sure your body's not hurting. A lot of people have, for instance, like a pull-up bar and just do it in between all throughout the day. So I actually think it's a very clever strategy to get your exercise in and also to get volume in. We had a JT, one of the bodyweight strength training experts, on our podcast recently. Hopefully that episode will actually come out soon. And he was saying that one of the biggest predictors of hypertrophy or building muscles is actually volume, right? You want to get a pretty decent amount of volume in, meaning like more, oftentimes, quite frankly, is better in terms of muscular development up to a certain limit. But for most people, they're not doing enough volume if they're trying to maximize hypertrophy. And sometimes the only way to get in extra volume is basically either training every day or training multiple times a day, and spreading it out, especially if you're trying to hit those numbers of 100 plus, is very effective, right? So I actually really like it as a strategy, and it's very analogous to walking, right? So when it comes to that low intensity exercise, I always advocate for everyone to do generally about 7,500 steps per day. Now, the reality is that's actually a decent amount of walking, depending on the pace of walking. But let's say you're an average adult male, you're probably going to walk, I think it's about 100 steps a minute if I'm using the right metric. So it takes about 50 minutes to walk 5,000 steps, or 75 minutes to walk 7,500 steps, as I recommended. That's a long walk, right? You're walking for an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, where if you're busy, as you're pointing out, working 10, 12, 14 hours a day, and you're like, shit, I got to go for an hour and 15-minute walk right now. The likelihood of you doing that is often very, very slim, or you're going to be too tired. You don't have enough time to do it. While if you break it up all throughout the day, this is what I do. I try to take, as I've mentioned on many of these shows before, 5 and 10-minute breaks in between every single meeting, right? 25-minute meeting, 5-minute break. 50-minute meeting, 10-minute break. But when I break it up like that, I might be taking 5 10-minute walks naturally throughout my workday. And so by the time when it gets to the end of work, I don't even need to go for a separate walk or do separate exercise. I'm like, I already got my 5,000 steps in, and I probably got the 2,500 just from, walking here to there, walking around my apartment, going and get a drink of water, something like that. And so I've already hit my 7,500 steps without ever even concretely trying to do it. So it's a very effective way of sort of getting your walking in. And I love that you're doing it to get even some strength training in terms of squats and push-ups. The third thing that I think might be very effective in using your strategy is actually doing the high intensity interval exercise. This is kind of a new model that's kind of come out, I would say, more recently. Typically, HIIT training is done all at once, mostly because it's actually short enough to do all at once. The original Tabata exercise protocol was in fact 4 minutes long, right? So after you've warmed up, you should do like a solid, 10-minute warm up. You're doing 20 seconds of a sprint, 10 seconds of rest. You repeat that 8 times. So 30 seconds times 8 is literally 4 minutes. And it's pretty efficient to do. The challenge with it is it doesn't take a lot of time, but it does take a lot of energy. Like if you're going a full bore sprint for 20 seconds with only a 10-second rest, and you're doing that 8 times in a row, you should be pretty tired at the end. In fact, the original Japanese speed skaters, I always say, who Tabata, the exercise physiologist, did this with, these guys were like, Olympic level medalists, and they're like laying on the ground huffing and puffing afterwards, right? It's an intense bout of exercise. So, one of the alternatives to doing it the traditional Tabata way is to actually do these sprints all throughout the day. So instead of doing 8 sprints back to back to back, which obviously just gets harder and harder because 10 seconds of rest is really not enough recovery, you could do 8 sprints all throughout the day, right? So instead of, for instance, going on a walk, a 5 or 10-minute walk in between your meetings, you could sit there and just do 10 or 20 air squats, 10 or 20 push-ups, and just pound that out let's say on the hour every hour for 8, 10, 12 hours that you're working. And so you're getting that in. Or I have some clients, for instance, who have an exercise bike at home, a treadmill, something where they can do sort of cardio. You can definitely hop on the bike, do a 20-second sprint. You're kind of doing that Tabata high intensity sprint. You're only doing that once, right? And then you wait till the next hour, the next break, the next opportunity to do that. But you're still getting the 8 bouts of sprints in spread out throughout the day, as opposed to doing it all at once. Now, it's not quite the same in the sense that obviously compressing it all does push your limit, push your body, push your heart rate up in a different way than spreading it out all out. But on the other hand, it is pretty effective, and you're much more likely to do it, quite frankly, because it's not as exhaustive. And literally, if it's like, I'm busy, I got a minute between meetings, but all I have to do is hop on the bike and do 20 seconds of pedaling or 20 push-ups or 20 air squats. That's all. you're much more likely to do it rather than, oh my God, I got to do this 10-minute warm up and then 4 minutes of sprint and then 5 minutes of cool down. So even Tabata takes 19 minutes when I was doing it. I used to run a high intensity interval training group at UCLA. So yeah, it's a 19, 20 minute workout minimum, even as compressed as it is. So I love that you share that example. I think it's great. And so I encourage everyone who's listening, try to do some sort of exercise spread out throughout the day. Even if you're a traditional gym goer, or you do whatever it is, some sort of compressed exercise, you're walking or you're sprinting, right? So if your traditional exercise is that medium intensity lifting weights at the gym or whatever it is, activity, playing basketball, whatever it is, complement it at the low end with walking throughout the day, or maybe even at the high end by kind of doing this sprinting or maximal exertion throughout the day. Obviously do it in a safe way, but it can actually really complement that traditional exercise that you do every day. Yeah, great. Let's ask the question from YouTube.
Hey Cam, any tactical advice for dealing with trauma, specifically trauma, the source of which you understand and can interpret?
Yeah, great question, Braden. So the question was around how do you deal with trauma, particularly from a source that you can understand and remember? If you're talking about sort of traditional trauma, so in psychology, we talk about trauma in the DSM as basically a threat to your life or the threat to someone's life very close to you, right? So you like witness someone either harmed or potentially have their life threatened. That's the criteria for PTSD, or what's called post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it's important to differentiate that because unfortunately people throw the word trauma around very willy-nilly. They talk about these micro traumas and things like that. And it's not that like, look, trauma, like any other thing, like anxiety is on a spectrum. I agree. But I think people are overusing the term, just like they're overusing the word toxic, in that not everything is a trauma. Just because you encounter difficulty or negative emotion, it's not a trauma. But if it's a serious thing, right? You had a serious adverse childhood event, or in your adulthood, you were threatened in some way that was could have or did result in serious psychological or bodily harm that's continuing to persist. I would say it would be very helpful to pursue sort of a trauma-focused therapy. And the element from all the research that we know that particularly seems to be helpful is kind of what's called exposure therapy. And so whether you do it in the context of a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, ACT or ACT, or CPT, cognitive processing therapy, these are all essentially different flavors of therapy. But the commonality or the common thread between all of them is that they're essentially exposure-based therapies. So I used to do this a lot with military veterans who had PTSD, obviously coming back from war or conflicts, often in operations Iraqi freedom, enduring freedom in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are the recent military conflicts that the US engaged in, or even as far back as the Korean or Vietnam Wars. In those instances, exposure-based therapy helps people go back to those instances. They recount them, which obviously brings up a lot of anxiety and stress, but you help reprocess that re-experiencing in a way that over time habituates or extinguishes it. So if someone's going back and telling a story about how their buddy got their arm blown off and it was obviously very traumatizing, it will push them up to like a 9 out of 10 in terms of their stress or anxiety response. But over time, doing it in a controlled way, in a safe space with a trusted therapist, that anxiety will go down from a 9 to an 8 to a 7 to a 6 to a 5 to a 3 to a level that's a lot more manageable and handleable. And that's sort of the magic of exposure therapy. You can even do this in mammals, as I've talked about. Any trauma that can essentially have you learn an anxious or stressed response, you can unlearn through exposure therapy. And so make sure the type of therapy that you're doing is exposure. Another form is called PE, or prolonged exposure, where you have people do this for, let's say, 30 minutes. They tell the story over and over again until their anxiety becomes a little bit more manageable. The latest research shows that you may not need to habituate, at least within the session, in terms of it going from a 9 to, let's say, a 4.5 in order to see the benefit. But over time, in terms of continually recounting the story session after session, it does help people get better and get that habituation extinction over time. You can obviously do that through someone's imagination in terms of closing their eyes and recounting that experience. You can do it through virtual reality nowadays, or you can go out in the real world. So for instance, if someone is uncomfortable with crowds because of their trauma, or driving because of their trauma, then you practice exposure to slowly driving, maybe out of the driveway, around the block. Little by little, you do what's called graduated exposure to start to re-encounter the things that you've been avoiding, because avoidance is essentially the root of what perpetuates trauma, or perpetuates sort of the traumatic syndrome, the illness, or what debilitates people. And so re-encountering that really helps people over time. So that's what I would suggest, is if you do have like a clinically significant amount of trauma that obviously comes from the criteria that I stated, working with a therapist that's well versed in sort of these exposure-based trauma therapies can be particularly helpful.
Hey Cam, I had a quick question. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, so recently I just started a new job, and we have all
Congratulations.
these employee resource groups. They're kind of categorized by race, ethnicity, and there's a lot of support groups for women, single mothers. But out of we have like 30 different resource groups. There actually wasn't even one for men, like just men in general.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on like resource groups for men? I mean, obviously, Maximus Tribe is kind of like a resource group for men, but
Totally.
when do you think that'll be like more mainstream, where men will be able to have like access to resource groups in their like jobs and workplaces?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael. Well, first of all, congrats on the new job. That's always exciting to start a new phase of life. Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some ways I can sort of empathize, in the sense that a lot of groups that may have been historically underrepresented may not have had sort of resource groups, right? Predominantly, at least up until modern times, men have obviously been the predominant sex in the workplace. And so perhaps there didn't need to be a men's group, because the company essentially was the men's group. So I think that may be a fair reason or rationale for why they haven't been sub-specific men's groups. And so why maybe more underrepresented sexes or minority groups might have wanted to have sort of clubs or interest groups, etc. That tide, I think, has changed a lot, in the sense that obviously in a very large employer, you still may want a men's group, even if there's a lot of men. Men are often in the minority in a lot of professions. Like for instance, in psychology, I would say 90% of new mental health grads are women. So if you're a male, especially if you're a straight male, you are by far in the minority. And so I think in some ways it's just as legitimate from an underrepresentation standpoint to have men's groups in certain fields, just from the numbers alone. In addition to that, obviously there are like men's specific interests, right? And so I think it's fair to have groups that are around specific aspects of men's health. I think there are good examples of this out in the community. There are other men's groups like Everyman, and there's a few others that are specifically around sort of masculine initiation and like development into being, a fully mature, well-developed man that's kind of rooted a little bit more in psychological theory, and kind of uses sort of community and community initiation to get people into that. They're kind of more men's development groups. They typically do have a group leader or facilitator. Typically they are a licensed mental health professional or someone trained as such. And it's a little bit more of like getting to know the same guys on a week-to-week basis and just talking through various issues. It could be like, hey, I'm like starting a new job, and how do I fit in? How do I find my place? Or it could be, like dealing with relationships and getting advice from other men on these issues. I think those are both very traditional models. Those have been around literally for decades. And I think they work well. They're almost like in a lot of ways analogous to like an AA model. Been around for a long time, and it's very accessible for people. But I actually think they are limiting in terms of their accessibility, in the sense that like they're private run organizations. You may not have the time or money or opportunity to go take off a weekend or go to these groups on a regular basis. And they're often very localized, right? That's in a lot of ways why we were inspired to kind of do this model with Maximus Tribe and be able to essentially recreate some of those elements online. I think you're going to see a lot more of this model pop up, whether it's with ours. I've certainly seen other sort of social media influencers run their own sort of men's groups that have different sort of angles or tinges. So I actually think we're seeing a lot more of a decentralized model, as biology would say. I don't think you're going to see the rise of this in workplaces. Unfortunately, they've become too politically correct and woke, and someone would complain that there's a men's group. As ridiculous as it is, like why do men not have the opportunity for representation just like anyone else? It's quite frankly silly and politicized. And the other thing is, I'm not even sure, even if there was a men's group, that men would feel super comfortable talking about it at work, because how much is privacy or confidentiality respected? Are you going to go snitch on your coworker or something like that? A lot of these groups really do, even if it's not enforced in any way, there's sort of a code of honor, code of conduct that says like whether there's no such thing as like anonymity, there's no such thing as privacy, especially in this social media era. We obviously even with this, we record these and put them up on podcasts because we're not talking about sensitive material. But our server is like semi-private, I would say. It's open for people who want to access it, but anyone can join. But I don't think you'll see it a lot in the workplace because inherently I don't think people do not trust their employers. And unfortunately, if you're at a big employer, there's probably a good reason for that. And there just needs to be healthy boundaries too. It's just like, even though for instance, your employer provides your health insurance, you don't want your boss knowing what medical conditions that you have or what prescriptions you're taking or all that stuff. It's anonymized, right? So your employer knows how much you cost in terms of your health expenditures, but doesn't need to know your private health information, which is protected by HIPAA anyway. So I think you're going to see a lot more of this decentralized model where it's going to be basically influencers or organizations like ours that are going to be leading the way, so that we can have essentially like a private resource outside of your work that you can connect to. Now, that doesn't necessarily replace the need for obviously in-person bonds, but that's exactly why we actually have the city-based channels on our Discord, right? So I think we have channels for at least the major metropolitan cities in the US: LA, Bay Area, New York, Vancouver, Seattle, Miami. I just started a new one for all the techies who are moving over there. But if you want to start your own in whatever city that you're in, feel free to do so. And I think we're over at, getting close to 1,000 guys on the Discord, and there's over 1,000 if you include Facebook and Reddit. So there's probably someone somewhere where you are, and we can definitely organize local meetups organically if people want to do that. And so it's a great option if you want to, complement essentially what we're doing online with a little bit of in-person supplementation. So thank you everyone who joined us on Discord, Clubhouse, Instagram Live, YouTube, and Facebook and Twitch. And we'll be back every Thursday at 6 o'clock. So you can continue to ask your questions. And so first come, first serve. If you submit it in advance, I'll be sure to get to it and answer it. And especially if you're willing to talk through it with me, I'm happy to coach you through it. It's always easier to talk through in a dialogue versus just answering questions that are typed. It's also more fun. So, all right, everyone, thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.